Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to this session. I'll give it another sort of 10 seconds or so just to give you a chance to get settled and coming in from the waiting room. Great, I can see some familiar faces that have popped up in other sessions across the festival. Thank you for being here. Yeah, that's lovely. If anyone would like to introduce themselves in the chat, feel free. We will be checking the chat towards the end of the session when we move to the Q&A. Okay, well, let's get started then. Thank you for all being here today and welcome to the Stay at Home Festival. We have a brilliant workshop for you today on editing, which is such an important skill for any kind of writer. And we're very lucky to have Debi here to lead this session. So Debi, if you'd like to get us started.
Thank you, Joanna. Hi, everybody. I've already seen a couple of familiar names coming up in the chat, but for those of you who don't know me, I'm Debi Alper. I'm the author of 5 novels. For the last 15 years, I've been working as a freelance editor. I edit an average of 2 to 3 novels a month. I'm also a creative writing tutor. I run the self-edit course for Jericho writers, which has been going for 10 years. And I'm also a competition judge. I've been a reader for the Costa Short Story Awards since their inception. And I'm also on the on the jury panel for the London Independent Story Prize. So hopefully that reassures you that I will know what I'm talking about. So this session is going to be on voice. And it's a really, really crucial one. I'll just explain to you how I'm going to divide up this coming hour. So first of all, I'm going to define voice and then talk about why it matters so much, why everybody makes such a big deal of it. I'm then going to break it down, first person, third person, and talk about the elements of a strong voice. We'll then be talking about some techniques to bring out your voice if it's elusive. I'll then give you some examples from published novels, and then hopefully there will be time for Q&A at the end. I'm not going to be checking the chat because I'm very easily distracted. And there's a lot to fit in. So I'm going to do my best to make the hour as useful for you as possible. Okay, so voice. Everybody talks about voice. Everyone says, oh, this is a fresh voice. Oh, voice is very important. Oh, this person, the voice leaps off the page. And then people struggle to define actually what that is. And actually, it's become mystified, and there's no mystery about it whatsoever. You all actually know what a voice is because you've got one of your own. And each of the people in this session, including me, will have a different voice, and that will be a product of the time in which we're living, our age, our class, our ethnicity, our life experiences, because what voice is, very simply, it is what we say and how we say it. So that sounds really, really obvious. Why is it so important? And why do we say that an agent could glance at the first page of your novel and decide it's not going to be for them? It's because voice is the hardest thing to fix if it's not in place. It's really easy to sort out a problem with characters, with plot, with structure. But if the voice is wrong or is not there, then it's going to be a problem throughout. And to be fair to agents, you may be thinking, but I've spent years on my novel. How come, they could just reject it at a glance at the first page? Well, actually, they're just being readers, and we all do the same. So, for example, in my role as Costa short story reader, over the summer, I read literally hundreds of short stories, and I have to distill that down to 12 that I believe are in with a genuine chance of winning the Costa Short Story Awards. And I don't read the whole story for probably the majority of them. And what do I base that on? It's voice every time. And to be fair, I think I'm now distracted because my cat's walking across the table, but hopefully she won't be distracting me too much. So what do we do as readers? If you go into a library or a bookshop and say you're browsing, you haven't gone to look for something specific. So maybe a cover will catch your eye, maybe a catchy title, and you'll pick that book up and you'll look at the blurb on the back and see if that grabs your attention. And if it does, most people will then open the book and look at the first page. And whether you're conscious of it or not, what will grab your attention is the voice. So that's why it matters so much. That's what it is and why it matters so much. So let's break that down now and see what we actually mean by voice. I've said it's what you say and how you say it. If we had time, I would set you an exercise, but we don't, because we've got to be really, really strict with the time, because there's a session immediately after mine. But in live sessions, I usually set an exercise and I divide the room up and I ask people to write something very, very simple in first person, a trip around the supermarket. So it's something that's familiar to everybody. But I divide the room and I say, right, this group of people, you're an 83-year-old pensioner. This group, you're a single parent with your children on board. This one, you're a man who's recently been widowed. And this group of people, you're a young teenager bunking off school. So immediately people start writing and they know that what they say and how they say it part is going to differ between each of those groups. The 83-year-old is not going to sound like the 15-year-old. So far, so obvious. So we then read them out afterwards. And what's really interesting is when somebody's bucked expectations and not gone with a stereotype, so done something a bit surprising. So maybe the man who's been recently widowed, he may have deeply loved his wife, but maybe he's quite excited about shopping for himself for the first time and deciding for himself what he would want to eat. And maybe the 83-year-old woman, maybe the teenager stops her shoplifting or something like that. So that's the kind of surprising stuff that you can bring out in voice that is a reflection of character. So that leads me on to thinking about first person voices. So a lot of people choose first person because they think it's the easiest thing to do. There is one voice throughout, apart from in dialogue, obviously. But actually, in terms of what they say and how they say it, a first person narrator's voice has two very, very discrete functions. One is as the storyteller, the narrator who is guiding us through this story, letting us know where we are, what's going on, guiding us in, giving us the essential choreography or the setting and so on and so on. But then they also have to be the character in action, the person who is dealing with all of the stuff that you throw at them in the plot, because plot and character, of course, are two halves of the same thing. So there is a difference between a first person narrator and a first person character, because somehow you have to make us buy into the idea that this person is experiencing this, which incidentally is why it is very, very difficult. My view, the most difficult voice to nail is first person and present tense, because your narrator is having to say they're being attacked physically, or there's some huge emotional gut punch going on. And the narrator's got to tell us about that at the same time as we're supposed to believe that the character is experiencing it. So that's quite a tricky thing to pull off. So I always think that if you are going to choose first person and present tense, there has to be a very strong narrative reason for making that choice. So for example, a character with amnesia, because they cannot remember their past, and so their sense of time is distorted. Certain mental health conditions, a very young child, because children live in the present. They don't think in terms of past, present, and future. Everything is in the now. So those are good reasons. If you are using first person and past tense, it's easier to pull apart those two roles for your first person voice. Now thinking about third person, my cat is desperate to get out and I can't leave you to let her out, but she is going to interrupt me any moment now, I know it. So in third person, it's easier to understand in a way because actually there are many voices. So you may have an external narrator, and I prefer to think of an external narrator rather than an omniscient narrator, because a lot of people misunderstand omniscience and end up doing a lot of head hopping. So she's walking around my chair. So an external narrator, the best example I can think of is Marcus Zuzak's The Book Thief, where it is explicit that there is an external narrator, and that narrator is actually death with a capital D. It may not be explicit in your novel that your narrator is a person, but you nevertheless need to think of them as though they are, because once you do that, you realize that they will have a voice. So that's the voice of your narrator. And then your characters also have voices, their point of view voices. And the deeper you move into a point of view, the more that character's voice will start to colour the prose. Now, drum roll, this is the most magical tool for any kind of writing. It's called psychic distance. Not everybody will have heard that term. I know some of you will. The ones whose names are familiar to me when I saw you popping up, you will know about it. Essentially, psychic distance is to do with how deep you go into a character's head and the extent to which their voice colours the prose. And there's this idea that there is a spectrum which goes from your external narrator, who has their voice, through to the character's voice when you are in a deep, deep POV. And the next part of the exercise that I give to people, if in the real life workshops, is to have taken that exercise where they were walking around the supermarket that was written in first person, and then to tweak the pronouns. So to change the I to he, she, they, my to his, hers, theirs, tweak the verbs, obviously, to be corrected. And what they suddenly find is that they've got a very, very voicey third person narrative. So it's actually quite a good trick. If you're finding it hard to bring out a point of view character's voice, try writing a scene in first person and then seeing if you can just adjust that. And the other thing that makes people think more when they're using first person is that they're more likely to uncover a character's interiority. And that's a really, really crucial part in a novel, because all of the other stuff, the scene setting, where characters are, the dialogue, what people look like and so on, what's going on around them, the incidental details, all of that's available in film and TV and stage plays and so on and so on. But novels, although some plays practice at it, novels are pretty much the only narrative form that can go deep inside characters' heads. And at that point, their voices drench the prose. Now, at this point, I'm going to share my screen with you because I just want to talk a bit more about psychic distance because it is such a transformative tool. We spend a whole week on it on the self-edit course that I run for Jericho writers. You can find out more in the term psychic distance comes from John Gardner's book, The Art of Fiction. There is an excellent article by David Jauss, Jauss, called From Long Shots to X-Rays, which talks about that business of zooming in. And the best possible resource is Emma Darwin's blog, This Itch of Writing. If you don't know it, then you're in for a treat. Go there, click on the toolkit tab, and you will uncover a whole massive range of resources, all free, brilliantly written, and there's a whole large section on psychic distance. So I can only briefly talk you through it, but here we go. Share screen, psychic distance. So John Gardner came up with this idea of there being 5 possible openings for a novel. And we call them PD 1 to 5, psychic distance 1 to 5. So the first one, it was the winter of the year 1853, a large man stepped out of a doorway. So that's very informative. We know where we are, vaguely we know when we are, and we're starting to see a scene. This is the external narrator. There's no hint of a point of view here. This man is anonymous. We don't know anything about him, apart from that he's large and he's doing something. Then at PD2, the second one, Henry J. Warburton had never much cared for snowstorms. So now we've got a name. We've moved in a little bit deeper, and we know something about Henry. We know that he doesn't like the cold, he doesn't like snow. And information is coming to us from the narrator. Then we've got the middle part there. Henry hated snowstorms. Now we're getting a little bit closer. We've got a bit less formal. The narrator is removing themselves and giving us a little bit more insight into Henry. We've lost the surname, and the emotional gut punch has got a bit stronger. Then comes the magical bit, PD4. God, how he hated these damn snowstorms. That is Henry's thought as it was at the time, but translated into third person and past tense. So at the time when he's stepping out of that doorway in 1853, he thinks to himself, God, how I hate these damn snowstorms. And what PD4 does is translate that into third person and past tense. It is very voicey. It gives us a very clear feeling of Henry. We are now complicit with Henry. We are hearing his voice. And then the final one, snow, under your collar, down inside your shoes, freezing and plugging up your miserable soul. That is pure Henry. There is no sign of the narrator there whatsoever. And the point that John Gardner is making, and David Joust makes, and we make, is that it's not a matter of some of this being better than other. It's a matter of seeing what you get at the different parts of the spectrum and making sure that you have fluidity. Because if you stay at one place, usually at PD3, then everything is very flat. It's like the equivalent of filming an entire movie with a static camera. And what you tend to get at that PD3, there it's Henry hated snowstorms, is a lot of filtering. Filtering is she, he, said, thought, remembered, heard. And the point is, if we're in a point of view, we know that we're already inside that character's head. We don't need the narrator to stand between us and the character and remind us of this narrator's presence. You can draw us closer to the character. So if you think about it as a piece of prose, it actually works quite well. Now that's a very, very abrupt subslide. You wouldn't have something in your novel that goes from outside to deep inside in 5 sentences in a formulaic slide. But if we started to expand that a bit, it might look something like this. This is me taking liberties with John Gardner, to whom I apologise. It was the winter of the year 1853. Temperatures had remained below zero for many weeks, and for the first time in living memory, the Thames had frozen over. Few ventured forth unless their business was urgent. One such man was Henry J. Warburton. In a wind-swept back street in Pimlico, he stepped out of a doorway, pulling up his coat collar and shivering. How I hate this damn snow, he thought, as the icy flakes stabbed the exposed skin of his cheeks. God, how he hated it. Hated the way, sorry, can you open the back door for the cat? Hated the way it slid under his collar, down inside his shoes, freezing and plugging up his miserable soul. Come on, man, brace yourself and move. Right, I'm going to come back, stop sharing there for a moment. So you can see what's going on there. You've got very distinct voices from this external narrator, deeper and deeper inside the character. And that's why psychic distance holds the key to character, voice, point of view, show and tell, because actually your narrator can do some telling, some exposition, and then it all moves into showing more and more of the character. So what am I going to do now? I'm now going to talk through some techniques for bringing out an elusive voice if you haven't got it. First of all, remember that voice is you communicating with your reader. So you need to find the appropriate voice for the story that you are telling. You might have a brilliant voice, but it might not be right for the story that you wish to tell. So, as an obvious example, if you're writing historical fiction set in Edwardian times, you wouldn't be using the same voice as you would for a contemporary thriller. Or if you were writing a heartrending story set in wartime, it would be a very different voice from one that you would use if you were writing romantic comedy. So getting the voice right for the genre is very, very crucial. And then you need to decide whether you have quite a formal voice or a conversational voice. And again, this will all depend on the story that you're writing, because there is no formula and there are no rules. And in fact, when it comes to voice, there are even fewer rules than you may imagine, because voice trumps everything. So, for example, it would be grammatically correct for me to say, my friends and I went to the park. But if my narrator was an urban teenager, he'd be more likely, or she would be more likely to say, me and my mates went down the park. Grammatically incorrect, but absolutely correct for your voice. We need to understand grammar and punctuation and all of those other things, but we can't be enthralled to them. We come first, our voice comes first, our story comes first, our characters come first, and our first loyalty has to be to them and not to the correct rules. So even things like punctuation, I think it's better to think in terms of rhythm, because prose has a rhythm, which is something else I will be talking about in a moment. Actually, I'll do that right now. Because when we talk about voice being what you say and how you say it, that's syntax, vocabulary choice, sentence construction, being grammatically incorrect, all of those different things that are a product of who we are also in terms of rhythm, because prose needs a rhythm just as much as poetry or music. So listen to this. This comes from Gary Provost. This sentence has 5 words. Here are 5 more words. 5-word sentences are fine, but several together become monotonous. Listen to what is happening. The writing is getting boring. The sound of it drones. It's like a stuck record. The ear demands some variety. Now listen. I vary the sentence length and I create music. Music. The writing sings. It has a pleasant rhythm, a lilt, a harmony. I use short sentences. And I use sentences of medium length. And sometimes, when I'm certain the reader is rested, I will engage him or her with a sentence of considerable length, a sentence that burns with energy and builds with all the impetus of a crescendo, the roll of the drums, the crash of the cymbals, sounds that say, listen to this, it is important. The person who wrote the 5-word sentence was Gary Provost, Provost. So reading aloud is really, really good, because you could easily, your eye will skim over stuff, and reading your own writing aloud, your ear will hear when that kind of flatness comes in. You'll hear when you've got lots and lots of filtering. You'll hear unintentional repetition. Look out for the beginnings of your sentences so that you mix it up. Everything's to do with variety, not staying in one place, not having the same sentence structures. So watch out for having too many sentences beginning with I or she or he, for example. But then don't make the mistake of then having sentences beginning with too many dangling modifiers. Walking into the room, she sat down on the chair. Opening the book, she started to read. Noticing on the first page that, etc., etc. So reading aloud is a really crucial tool. So how else can we find a voice if it's elusive? First of all, don't worry too much if it's not there in your first draft. Your first draft, depending on how you write, and everybody needs to find their own way, most people, your first draft will be spilling the story out, knowing it will be crap, allowing it to be crap, and then having something to work on, to edit, because no published novel was ever written as a first draft, believe me. So if your first draft, because you need to keep that story spilling out, it will probably be full of cliches and secondhand language and all that stuff, because you don't want to pause for too long to think over the perfect word choice. You can bring that in at the editing stage. The other thing is to imagine your reader and speak to them directly. The great oral tradition of storytelling. Imagine that. So imagine whether your external narrator is you or not, or whether it's a first person narrator, imagine speaking to your reader. Open up your senses. Eavesdrop on conversations. If you can get on a bus at the moment, I haven't been on a bus for over a year, but there we go. At supermarkets, things like that. Take out your iPod and actually listen. Pick up on sensory information. Always have a notepad, jot things down. Try not to be too self-conscious. Try not to be too, what I think of as authorial. Your characters need to have their voices, and you need not to impose yourself too much on that. So free writing, if you know what I mean, where you just sit down and give yourself a set amount of time and just keep writing, don't do any kind of editing, but that quite often breaks down those barriers and stops you being too self-conscious. Secondhand language, cliches, stuff like that. If one of your characters thinks in cliches, okay, but then make a big deal of it so it's very, very clear that it is your intention as the author. If that character is your first person narrator, you've got more of a problem. In fact, I would say that's probably a warning not to have a first person narrator, but to have third person, so that you can have contrast to that second handness of the character's voice. Get to grips with psychic distance. It works in first person as well. There it's to do with what I was talking about before, distinguishing between the role of the voice of the narrator and the role of the character in action. Understand adjectives and adverbs, and understand why we are often told to cut so many of them. Use them for good. Use the right ones. Don't use strings of adjectives which just give the impression that you couldn't decide which one was the best one. Adverbs are so, they scream out newbie writer and unconfident. If you've tagged every verb with an ly adverb, and I often suggest to people that they do a word search just on ly and see how many you've got. Now, I'm not saying eliminate them all. There's another exercise that I do in real life workshops where I ask people to write down as many alternatives to the verb and adverb walked slowly. And I've been running that one for a few years now. And at the end of it, I've been writing down my list. And at the end of it, if there are any new ones, then I add them onto my list. And believe it or not, I've got over 120 synonyms for walked slowly. Now, to be clear, there might be times when, for the rhythm of your prose, walk slowly is exactly what you want. I'm not saying you can never ever use an adverb. I never say never ever about anything, because you can do, this is my big mantra, you can do anything you like if you do it well enough. Don't overwrite. That's where it feels like the author is just trying too hard. Simpler is often more powerful. Don't underwrite, don't undersell yourself. Give the reader everything that they need. I was talking before about film and TV and plays. If you think about it, think about film. We get atmosphere from camera angles, incidental music. We can see the scene. We can see the characters. We can see what they're doing. We can see what's going on around them. We have to do all of that with words. And then we can take that extra step and climb inside a character's skin and see them from the inside. So use all those different parts of the psychic distance spectrum. Learn to punctuate and spell and use grammar correctly. There's a very useful site. It's the Bristol University site, Bristol AC. I can't remember the URL, I'm afraid. But if you Google Bristol AC, they have a huge page on grammar and punctuation, and there's exercises that are very useful. And then once you know how to do it, break those rules. Because as I said, voice comes first. Enrich your word hoard, read widely, read aloud, as I said. Time is really marching on. I knew this would happen. I want to give you some examples of very, very strong voices. So I'm going to start with third person. So this is from The Book Thief by Marcus Zusak. Beautiful, beautiful book. And it's set out on the page in a very idiosyncratic manner. First, the colours, then the humans. That's usually how I see things, or at least how I try. Here is a small fact. You are going to die. I am, in all truthfulness, attempting to be cheerful about this whole topic, although most people find themselves hindered in believing me, no matter my protestations. Please trust me. I most definitely can be cheerful. I can be amiable, agreeable, affable. And that's only the A's. Just don't ask me to be nice. Nice has nothing to do with me. So you might think that's actually a first-person narrator because, of course, it is written in I, but they are so externalized as death that it almost qualifies as a third-person narrator. And the surprising thing about that is that there's nothing grim and macabre about this death. Zuzak's death is kind, witty, funny, and feels very real. So that's an example of a very strong voice. As a contrast, my apologies in advance, I'm dreadful at doing accents, but I need to try. So this is Alan Guthrie, Hardman. So imagine a much better Scottish accent, and I really hope I'm not going to offend anybody. Another hot day in July. That was 4 in a row. Pretty good for Scotland. Not so good for the corpse in the boot. I'm going to switch off the accent. Jacob Baxter put his hand over his nose to mask the smell, forgetting for a moment that his nose was broken. He gasped with pain. Time to take some more paracetamol, but he couldn't swallow the pills without a glass of water. He'd have to wait till he got back home. Anyway, continuing. What you get immediately from that is that brilliant, hot day, pretty good for Scotland. We know where we are. This is an external narrator, not so good for the corpse in the boot. So we've got humour in there, and this sets the tone for, this gives us the expectation of what we're going to get in this story, and it's through the voice. Another contrast. So this is the God of Small Things, Arundhati Roy. May in Yemen is a hot, brooding month. The days are long and humid. The river shrinks and black crows gorge on bright mangoes in still dust-green trees. Red bananas ripen. Jackfruits burst. Dissolute blue bottles hum vacuously in the fruity air. Then they stun themselves against clear window panes and die, fatly baffled in the sun. So that's really, really rich and textured. There's a lot of adjectives in there. A lot of them are colours, black crows, red bananas, and so on. There's two adverbs, hum vacuously and fatly baffled. So when you do something and do it well, that is an example of an external narrator being used to set the scene, and we might never know who that narrator is. It's not relevant to us, but we certainly feel like they are a real person. So now let's think about a couple of first person narrators. So this is from Home by Amanda Berriman. And this is written in the voice of a 4-year-old child. So there's obviously immediately a kind of a conceit there, because we're supposed to buy in to this story, which is very much an adult book, being written by a very young child. Another example of that is Room, which many of you may have come across, and Claire King's The Night Rainbow. But this one is Amanda Berriman. As I say, it's very much a book for adults, but this is a 4-year-old child. There's a gap where the living room curtains don't touch, and night orange has sneaked in and painted everything in the room so it's hardly dark at all. My favourite pen is on the windowsill, where I hided it from Toby, and I take it and squeeze it behind the telly to get the peeling paper. It's soft and soggy on my fingers, and under it there's even more black dots than a 4, and my pictures of the house with lots of windows and the horse and the apple tree and the swing have slided down the wall a bit. There isn't a pond yet, so I joined some dots up in a pond shape and add tails to the dot inside the pond so they look like tadpoles. Jessica! My arm is pulled hard and hard, and Mummy is screaming, "Moles, moles, Jessica, dirty," and she pulls me fast away from my picture, and the telly hits my head, and I'm shouting, "Ow, ow, ow," and so on and so on. So it's in first person, and it is probably one of the strongest examples of a voice that you could find, because we totally buy into this being a 4-year-old child. And even though much of the subject matter of the story itself is dark, seeing it through the eyes of a child makes it more powerful, more painful, but also more heartwarming, and forces us to relate to the child that we were at the time. So how are we doing for that? Oh my God, the time's going so fast. Okay, I'm going to skip over my next 2 examples because I want to give one more that just demonstrates psychic distance in first person. So here we go. I'm going to do this one. So this is Gillian Flynn. I'm not mispronouncing her name. It is pronounced Gillian. And this is from Dark Places, which in my opinion is the best of her books. And very briefly, the setup here is that the narrator witnessed the massacre of her family as a very young child. She is now an adult and obviously deeply, deeply damaged. And the story forces her to go back to that time mentally. And of course, her defenses are sky high. It's the last thing that she wants is for those defenses to be battered down. So this is a section of that. I ended up making Lyle handle all the arrangements. I told him I couldn't get through to the right person. I was overwhelmed by it all. The truth was, I just didn't want to. I don't have the stamina. Press button, press numbers, wait on hold, talk, wait on hold, then be real nice to some pissed off woman with 3 kids and annual resolutions to go back to college. Some woman just wiggling with hope you'll give her an excuse to pull the plug on you. Oh, she's a bitch, all right, and you can't call her that. All of a sudden, there you are, shoots and ladder back to the beginning, and that's supposed to make you nicer when you phone back. Let Lyle deal with it. So what you've got there is at the beginning of that, in that first sentence I ended up, that's her as the narrator telling us something that's going to be happening. And then she goes, she's letting us know that she found it overwhelming. And she's being very honest here, she didn't want to. And she starts off by explaining quite rationally that she doesn't have the stamina. And then gradually she's sucked back in, and she's created this woman who's entirely from her own, inside her own head. It's a fantasy. This woman doesn't exist. It's just an affirmation of this terrible negative worldview that the narrator has. And so she plunged into this horrible reality. And it's a very claustrophobic place to take your reader to. And they're not going to want to be there for very long, probably. And then at the end, she pulls back, let Lyle deal with it. And so she's moved back to being the narrator. And one other quick one, and I won't read this one out, but if you've read The Goldfinch by Donna Tartt, one of the rules that breaks is that the promise made at the beginning, which is that this story is all going to be about the painting the goldfinch, is actually resolved further from the end than is usual in most books. Usually that resolution comes quite near the end. In Tartt's one, she has a whole long section where the narrator sits in the now of the story, even though it's past tense, thinking back over their past. And that whole thing is one sentence, and it pulls in and it pulls out and it pulls in and it pulls out. So I'm going to just stop sharing my screen because, my goodness, I think we've only got, we haven't got much time left. So are there lots of questions? If there's not, I can do some more examples, but I do want you to have a chance to ask questions. So Joanna.
We have 2 questions. So you maybe have time for one more example, maybe?
Okay, cool. Do bring on more questions, guys, because you may think that your question is specific to you, but very frequently people will ask a question, 2 more examples, that other people will go, oh yeah, I wanted to know the answer to that too. Okay, so this is an older child. This is, I think she's 13 at this stage. And here again, I apologise, this is a Nottinghamshire accent. This is The Killing Jar by Nicola Monaghan. Some people would say I was destined for all this killing when Uncle Frank came into my life, but it goes back further than that, to when my brother was born. John came out wailing like a banshee and didn't stop for months. It were Mum's fault, that. Her bad habits got him hooked on smack and coke before he was even born, poor bugger. She didn't care much that he was screaming. She slept and slept after he was born and let the nurses feed him from a bottle. Your mum's very tired, one of them told me. I shrugged. Mum had always slept a lot and I'd never thought much of it. I looked at the baby, his mouth open and tongue wriggling as he screamed. I noticed how he used his whole body to cry with. Looking back now, I wonder why the nurses didn't give him a bit of methadone or something to help him out. They let him go cold turkey instead. What a way to come into the world. Never stood a chance, our John. So that's a regional accent. Other examples, obviously, Irving Welsh, Train Spotting, Shuggy Bain, Marlon James, 7 Killings. None of those stick to your correct grammar, pronunciation, even spelling. And my other example I wanted to give you is Lovely Bones by Alice Sebold. It's another first-person example. And this is very much first person as narrator. It's the beginning of the book. My name was Salmon, like the fish. First name Susie. I was 14 when I was murdered on December 6, 1973. In newspaper photos of missing girls from the 70s, most looked like me, white girls with mousy brown hair. This was before kids of all races and genders started appearing on milk cartons or in the Daily Mail. It was still back when people believed things like that didn't happen. In my junior high yearbook, I had a quote from a Spanish poet my sister had turned me on to, Juan Ramon Jimenez. It went like this: if they give you ruled paper, write the other way. So what you've got there is the first person's voice as the narrator, telling, note, the reader what her name was, the fact that she was murdered, the actual date of her being murdered. If you think back to those John Gardner examples of psychic distance, that's an example of it in first person. So are we ready? Because I can do more.
No, I think
let's have a couple of questions, because I can always go back to more if there's no more questions forthcoming.
Great. Okay, so we have one from Deepika. Hi, Debbie. Thank you for your insightful talk. Are there any circumstances where writers might consider scrapping what they've written of a first draft if they're not happy with the character or the character perspective or tense they've used, and start again with a new draft?
Oh, really good question. Sorry, is that it? Go on.
There's a small section, but or should they write on to the end regardless and fix any issues in the second draft?
Okay. Everybody needs to find their own way of working. So, and your way of working might even work for one book and not for another book. So flexibility is the key. There is no definitive answer that I can give you here, but I can tell you what I think works best. I think the first draft of anything has to be crap. I think you have to let your story flood out. I think you have to reduce your expectations of what it might be. I think you have to allow it to take you in directions you might not have anticipated. I think you have to, creating characters is a bit like parenting. You know, you give birth to these little creatures and you think you can mold them. And in the beginning you can, and then a point comes when they say, no, we're our own person and that we're going to do our own things. And it's the same with your fictional characters. So, you know, if you had a plan to force them to do something and they go, no, I don't want to do that, even though it will take your story into a different direction, then yes, listen to those characters, definitely. I think it's best personally to complete your rubbish first draft. So write drunk, edit sober is the other mantra. So allow it to be rubbish, and then you've got something to work on. And then you can start to, I think editing works best when you go from macro to micro. So start off by looking at the structure. Have you started in the right place? Are you ending in the right place? Have you got peaks and troughs as you go? As Emma Darwin would call it, is every fortunately followed by an unfortunately? So you've got this chain of cause and effect, action and consequence, and so on. Have you got the peak of your narrative arc, unless you've done a top, quite near the end? And are you not wrapping up everything too closely? That kind of stuff first. Then start looking at your characters and so on. And then your last task should be the minutiae of your prose style. That bit where you start thinking about what psychic distance you're at, making sure that you're not sticking in one point. I do have to say that people who read widely tend to know a lot of stuff about voice without being conscious that they know it. So they will probably be using psychic distance without recognizing that that's what they're doing. But I do come across many manuscripts and people on the course where people have come really close to getting a deal. So their covering letters work, their synopsis has worked, and there's enough going on in the first chapter for the agent to ask for a full. And then they come back and quite often they just say, didn't love it enough, or something really frustrating like that, which you think, what's that mean? What's that mean? And in almost every case that I've found, it's because it's been written at this flat psychic distance. So quite often right in the middle of that spectrum, with everything at PD3 with loads of filtering, because in the middle of the psychic distance spectrum, you don't properly get the voice of an external narrator because they're too busy looking at the character. And you don't get the character's voice because the narrator is standing between the character and the reader. So making sure that you have that I've read books like that flat. Yes, I know. Some really highly commercial books work even if they're not as, I don't want to sound snobby, as well written, in that readers want them, and good luck to readers, and we should all have those kind of sales figures, because there's a really strong plot. For example, you know, the Dan Browns, you know, what he does is gripping pace and he doesn't care about anything else. And people who love his books, good luck to them. That's what they go for. But if we want to write really wonderful books, and I really want everybody to write really wonderful books, then using that kind of variety and flow. I've kind of wittered on there. Sorry, carry on.
No, we have 4 more questions. We may need to keep them a little slightly shorter, but it was really interesting. I didn't want to stop.
I had too much to say.
So we have one from Isabella, who's coming from Vienna. In regards to grammar and tone, have you got any tips for those who are writing English as a second language?
That's a really tricky one. That's a really, really tricky one. I have so much respect for anybody who writes in a language that's not their first language, because God knows it's hard enough when it is. I think you need beta readers. So I think you need to, again, read really, really widely in English. But you probably need an English as first language beta reader, because quite often, actually, I've just finished editing a manuscript by somebody. I mean, she's Polish and she's completely nailed it. And yet there are just tiny little things, quite often in the tenses, or a word choice that just doesn't quite get there. So yes, either have an editor or a beta reader.
Great. So we have from Amanda Potter. When writing third person close, should you make sure that you don't reveal feelings, thoughts, and knowledge of other characters and stick to the primary character only?
Yes, unless they're very astute and insightful. So the problem with third person, if you're not careful, is head hopping. Oh, I could go on for ages. Head hopping is when you go from very deep inside a character's skin and voice, jumping to straight inside another character's skin and voice. That doesn't work. You're asking the reader to relate to two people at the same time, and we end up not relating to anybody. So if you need to swap POV, and make sure you really do, you need to come back towards the narrator, and then let the narrator guide you back in. If you're deep inside one POV, unless that character is the kind of person that can imagine what somebody else is thinking, no, they can't, is the short answer. Shortish.
Oh, wow. So one more from Tamara Gill. Do you think switching between first and third person perspective can be effective?
Yeah, yes, I do. But it's not easy. You have to have, look, you need to find what works for your story. A lot of people choose first person for the wrong reasons. They choose it because they think it's the only way to get deep, up close and dirty with a character, and that is not true. And that's what psychic distance is about. So you can do that in third person. So I recently started writing down, over the last couple of years, published novels. Now, these are authors at the top of their game. And so, for example, Claire McIntosh, Let Me Die, more than one first person present tense voice and a third person past tense. Tammy Cohen, They Will Fall Down, first person present tense, unreliable. Third person past tense, more than one POV. I have huge numbers of these. C.L. Taylor, the Fear, mix of first and third person, all present tense, although lots of backstory. Someone's just asked about how about second person. Very hard to sustain for a whole novel. It can be very effective in short bursts because it does make you feel like you are being pulled into the story and it's happening to you. It's not easy to sustain for a whole novel, but like I say, you can do anything if you do it well enough. So yes, there are lots and lots of people. Adele Parks, I invited her in first person present tense for the MC and two others, and third person past tense for other POVs. So yes, it can be effective, but your story has to work better written in that way. I always think it's actually better to go with the simplest of anything, simplest structure, linear chronology, simplest voice, either first person past tense or third person and maybe one POV, and then only add layers of complexity if it makes your story work better.
Wow, thank you so much. We have time for, I think, just one more question, which is going to be quite a hard one to answer, I think, but one we all want to know an answer to. So Pushpinder has asked, how do you know the voice is right for the story?
By asking somebody else, probably. If it's, I mean, get a strong voice, first of all. If you have, exactly, feel it. If you have created a strong voice, it's almost definitely going to be right. If you're committed to your story and that voice has come to you, it's almost definitely going to be right. But get someone else to check it for you.
Thank you so much. I think that is all we have time for. So I'm sorry we didn't get to answer a couple of those questions, but you're on Twitter, I believe.
I am. Do come and ask questions on Twitter. I'm more than happy to answer.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for this session, Debbie. I think that was really, really useful and insightful for our
Thank you.
lovely
Thank you.
audience.
Take care, everybody. Stay